Close your eyes for a moment and imagine dust. Not the sterile dust of modern homes, but the ancient dust of countless footsteps, hooves, and wheels that once traced invisible lines across continents. This is the dust of the Silk Road, though it was never called that by those who walked it. They simply called it the way forward, the path to somewhere else, the long road home. Tonight, we're going to step away from the grand narratives of empire and conquest that usually define this legendary network of trade routes. Instead, we'll settle into the quieter stories, the ones that unfolded in workshop corners, around flickering oil lamps, in the margins of official histories. These are the stories of hands that wove silk by candlelight, feet that carried precious cargo across impossible distances, and minds that navigated not just geography, but the delicate spaces between cultures. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us on these quiet journeys through the past. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and let's begin. We start our journey not with emperors or explorers, but with someone whose story has been largely forgotten, a silk weaver in Tang Dynasty China, whose dreams reached far beyond the walls of her workshop, toward markets she would never see, but whose demands shaped every thread she spun. Verse 1. The Silk Weaver's Dreams. The morning begins before dawn, as it always has, with the soft whisper of silk threads catching the first pale light filtering through paper windows. Your fingers, stained permanently, now with the indigo and vermilion of countless dyes, move across the loom with the practiced rhythm of someone who learned this craft, not from books, but from watching your grandmother's hands perform the same ancient dance. You are Li Mei, though that name appears in no historical record. You exist in the space between documentation, one of the countless skilled workers whose labor made the Silk Road possible, yet whose individual stories were rarely deemed worthy of preservation. But here, in this moment, in this small workshop tucked behind your family's modest home in Chang'an, your story unfolds with the quiet persistence of silk emerging from cocoons. The workshop is small, perhaps 10 feet square, with walls of wood and packed earth that seem to breathe with the humidity of the work. Skeins of raw silk hang from wooden pegs, their natural cream color waiting for transformation. The air carries the faint sweetness of mulberry leaves, food for the silkworms that make your livelihood possible mixed, with the earthy scent of the dyes that will soon transform these plain threads into something worthy of distant markets. Your loom is not grand. It's a simple wooden frame, worn smooth by generations of use, inherited from your grandmother and her grandmother before her. The warped threads stretch taut, creating a grid of possibility. Each thread must be perfect, no weakness, no irregularity that might reveal itself only when the finished cloth is stretched across the back of a merchant's camel, days or weeks into an unforgiving journey. As you work, your mind wanders to the stories that filter back from the markets. Chang'an is a city of rumors, a place where information travels as readily as goods. You've heard tell of the great bazaars of Samarkand, where your silk might one day hang beside precious stones from the mountains of Afghanistan. You've listened to merchants describe the Roman women who prize Chinese silk so highly they're willing to pay its weight in gold, though you suspect this claim grows with each telling. But what captures your imagination most are the smaller details. The merchant Liu Wei, who stops by your workshop every few months to examine your latest work, has described the caravanserai, those oasis trading posts where travelers rest between cities. He speaks of evening meals shared around communal fires, where silk traders from China eat alongside spice merchants from India, and where your cloth might serve as bedding for a Byzantine monk, or a wrapping for precious manuscripts traveling to distant libraries. The work itself requires a meditation-like focus. Each pass of the shuttle must be precise. Each beat of the reed that presses the weft threads tight must be consistent. He pattern you're weaving today is one you've memorized through countless repetitions, a design of stylized phoenixes and flowering vines that has been popular in the capital for 3 seasons now. But you know that by the time this bolt of silk reaches its final destination, perhaps in the markets of Constantinople or the private chambers of a Persian nobleman, the fashion will have moved on to something new. This disconnect between creation and consumption is part of the strange romance of your profession. You weave for people you will never meet, for occasions you can barely imagine. The silk that passes through your hands might become a wedding dress for a foreign princess, or ceremonial robes for a religious leader whose faith you've never heard described. Each piece carries within it not just the work of your hands, but the dreams and aspirations of someone far away. The quality of silk you produce is determined by factors that begin long before you touch the threads. The mulberry trees that feed the silkworms must be healthy, their leaves picked at just the right moment. The silkworms themselves must be tended with almost maternal care, their cocoons harvested at the precise moment of ripeness. The process of killing the pupae inside, a necessary step to prevent them from breaking through the cocoon and disrupting the continuous silk fiber, must be done with hot water heated to exactly the right temperature. You learn these details not from direct experience, but from the stories of those who worked earlier in the process. The silk industry in Tang China is highly specialized, with each step performed by different artisans. Your role is the final transformation, taking the prepared silk threads and turning them into cloth that will justify the enormous expense and risk of long-distance trade. The value of what you create is almost incomprehensible in terms of everyday life. A single bolt of the finest silk might trade for enough grain to feed a family for months, or enough tea to stock a merchant's shop for a season. Yet you live modestly, your workshop a world away from the luxury your product will eventually provide to distant customers. The rhythm of weaving creates space for contemplation. As your shuttle moves back and forth, you find yourself wondering about the geography of desire. What is it about silk that makes people willing to transport it across mountains and deserts, through territories controlled by bandits and rulers who demand tribute? You felt the fabric yourself. Of course, its smoothness, its ability to be both warm and cool depending on the season, the way it holds dye with an intensity that wool and linen cannot match. But there must be something more. Perhaps it's the knowledge that silk requires such delicate cultivation, such careful tending of creatures as fragile as silkworms. Perhaps foreign customers prize not just the fabric, but the story it tells about the patience and skill of an entire civilization. When a Byzantine merchant runs silk through his fingers, he's touching not just cloth, but the accumulated wisdom of generations of Chinese artisans. Your own dreams, as you work, tend toward the practical. You imagine improvements to your loom that might allow for more complex patterns, or new dye combinations that might produce colors no one has seen before. You wonder what would happen if you could somehow incorporate the golden threads you've heard described, silk wrapped with actual gold wire that creates a fabric so precious it's reserved for imperial use. But your dreams also drift toward the geographical. You've never traveled more than a day's walk from Chang'an, yet your work connects you to a network that spans continents. Sometimes, as you weave, you try to imagine the journey your silk will take. First, the short trip to the local market, where merchants like Lu Wei will examine dozens of bolts before selecting the ones that meet their standards. Then, the loading onto pack animals for the journey west. You've heard enough merchant stories to know the basic geography. First, the relatively easy journey through Chinese territory, where imperial roads are well maintained and bandits are kept mostly at bay by regular patrols. Then, the more challenging passage through the Western territories, where the Han Chinese Empire fades into a patchwork of smaller kingdoms and tribal territories. The high mountain passes where the cold can kill, and the desert stretches where water is more precious than the silk itself. But what you find most intriguing are the stories of cultural exchange that happen along the way. Lu Wei has described markets where Chinese silk merchants might find themselves negotiating with Sogdian traders, who speak neither Chinese nor the local language, conducting business through interpreters and the universal language of gesture. He's told you about Buddhist monks who travel the same routes, carrying religious texts and ideas alongside the merchant's more material goods. This mixing of cultures is something you can barely imagine. Chang'an itself is cosmopolitan by Chinese standards, with foreign merchants and diplomats bringing their own customs and languages. But you've lived your entire life within the familiar rhythms of Chinese culture. The idea of traveling to places where the very assumptions about proper behavior, about religious practice, about family structure are completely different is both fascinating and terrifying. As the morning progresses and the light grows stronger, you pause periodically to examine your work. The phoenix pattern is emerging beautifully. The bird's stylized feathers created by subtle variations in thread tension that will catch light differently depending on how the fabric is displayed. This is a technique you developed yourself, a small innovation that you hope will help your silk stand out in whatever market it finally reaches. The perfectionism required for this work is both a blessing and a curse. Every thread must be exactly right, because a single flaw, a broken thread, an uneven tension, a mistake in the pattern can render an entire bolt worthless. The merchants who buy your silk have trained eyes and will spot imperfections that might be invisible to casual observers. But this same attention to detail is what makes the work satisfying. Each completed piece represents not just hours of labor, but a small victory over the chaos of imperfection. You've heard stories of silk weavers in other regions who work with different techniques, different patterns, different qualities of thread. The silk produced in Sichuan province, for example, is said to have a different texture, a result of the particular variety of mulberry trees that grow in that climate. The weavers of Suzhou are renowned for their incredibly fine work, creating silk so delicate it seems to float when held up to the light. These regional variations mean that your silk will carry with it not just the mark of Chinese craftsmanship, but the specific signature of Chang'an production. Experienced merchants, you've been told, can identify the origin of a piece of silk just by touch, recognizing the subtle differences in texture and weight that result from local techniques and materials. As the morning continues, you allow yourself to imagine the ultimate destination of your work. Perhaps this particular bolt will end up in the wardrobe of a Byzantine noble, used for formal occasions in a court where the intricacies of Chinese fashion are barely understood but deeply appreciated. Or maybe it will become part of a merchant's trade inventory, cut into smaller pieces and sold to customers across the Mediterranean world. The time it takes for your silk to reach its final destination is almost as incomprehensible as the distance. A bolt of silk that you complete today might not be worn by its ultimate owner for 6 months or more. By then, you'll have completed dozens of other pieces, moved on to new patterns, perhaps even new techniques. The connection between your hands and the eventual user of your work is stretched across both space and time, a thread as long and delicate as the silk itself. The workshop grows warmer as the sun climbs higher, and you pause to open the wooden shutters that cover the windows. The sounds of the neighborhood drift in other artisans beginning their daily work. The calls of street vendors, the clatter of carts on the stone streets. Chang'an is waking up around you, the great capital of the Tang dynasty, beginning another day of the commerce and culture that make it the center of the known world. But even as you're part of this grand imperial system, your work connects you to something larger. The silk you weave is part of a network of exchange that links Chinese workshops to Persian bazaars, to Indian ports, to Roman markets. It's a network that carries not just goods, but ideas, technologies, artistic styles, and religious beliefs. Your silk might travel alongside Buddhist sutras being carried to new monasteries, or Islamic texts being translated into new languages. As you return to your loom, settling back into the familiar rhythm of the work, you carry with you all these imagined connections, Each pass of the shuttle is not just another step in the creation of cloth, but another link in a chain that connects your small workshop to the vast world beyond the mountains. Your dreams, woven into the silk itself, will travel farther than you ever will, carrying with them the story of patient hands and careful craft, of a civilization that has learned to transform the cocoons of insects into objects of beauty and desire. The morning's work continues, steady and sure, as your silk takes shape thread by thread, dream by dream, connecting you to a world that stretches far beyond the walls of your workshop, far beyond the boundaries of your imagination. Verse 2. Marco Polo's long journey, what he saw and what he didn't, the transition from the intimate world of the silk weaver's workshop to the grand scope of Marco. Polo's journey is like stepping from a candlelit room into the vast darkness of a star-filled night. Where Li Mei's story unfolds in the careful repetition of daily craft, Marco Polo's tale stretches across decades and continents. A single life threaded through the entire length of what we now call the Silk Road. But here's what's remarkable about Marco Polo's account. For all its scope and ambition, for all the wonders he claimed to witness, there are curious gaps in his observations. Things that any traveler along these routes would have encountered, yet somehow escaped his notice or his telling. Tonight, we'll walk alongside this most famous of Silk Road travelers, but we'll pay attention not just to what he saw, but to what he missed, what he chose not to record, and what these omissions tell us about the nature of travel, memory, and storytelling itself. Marco Polo was 17 when he left Venice in 1271, accompanying his father Niccolo and uncle Maffeo on their second journey to the court of Kublai Khan. 17 in age when the world still seemed infinitely large and endlessly full of possibility. Try to imagine that young man standing on the dock in Venice, watching the familiar campaniles of San Marco fade into the morning mist, not knowing that he wouldn't see his home again for 24 years. The Venice they left behind was already a city built on distant connections. The great merchant families had made their fortunes by understanding that luxury had no permanent home, that spices from India, silk from China, precious stones from Persia could find eager buyers among the wealthy of Europe. The Polo family were part of this merchant aristocracy, already experienced in the art of transforming distance into profit. But experience, it turns out, is a poor preparation for the sheer scale of what lay ahead. The journey to Kublai Khan's court would take them 3.5 years, not because they traveled slowly, but because the distances involved were almost incomprehensible to European minds. From Venice to Beijing is roughly 4,000 miles as the crow flies. But the Polos would not travel as the crow flies. They would follow trade routes that curved around mountains, sought out water sources in deserts, and navigated the political territories of dozens of different rulers. The first leg of their journey took them across the Mediterranean to Acre, in what is now Israel. Here, they received letters from the Pope diplomatic credentials that were supposed to ease their passage through Christian and Muslim territories alike. But as they would discover, papal authority carried little weight in the remote mountain passes of the Pamir or in the trading cities of Central Asia, where local custom mattered more than distant blessing. From Acre, they traveled overland through territories that modern travelers know as Turkey, Iran, and Afghanistan. These names would have meant nothing to the Polos. They thought in terms of cities and rulers, not the nation-states that would emerge centuries later. They passed through Trebizond on the Black Sea coast, Tabriz in Persia, and eventually reached the great trading city of Balkh in what is now northern Afghanistan. It was in these early stages of the journey that Marco Polo encountered his first taste of the cultural complexity that would define his entire experience. In every city, they found communities of merchants, from distant places Chinese traders in Persian cities, Indian spice dealers in Turkish markets, Jewish merchants serving as translators and intermediaries in Muslim territories. The Silk Road was not just a route for goods, but a highway for people, ideas, and languages that mixed and blended in ways that defied simple categorization. Yet curiously, Marco Polo's later account pays relatively little attention to this cultural mixing. His descriptions tend to focus on the exotic and the customs that seemed most foreign to Venetian eyes rather than the mundane realities of cross-cultural commerce. He writes extensively about unusual marriage customs, strange religious practices, and peculiar local foods, but says little about how merchants from different cultures actually conducted business with each other. This pattern of selective observation would continue throughout his journey. As the Palas made their way through the high passes of the Pamir Mountains, the roof of the world, as it was known, Marco Polo noted the effects of altitude, the difficulty of lighting fires in the thin air, the way that food took longer to cook. These are the practical observations of someone actually making the journey. But he also claimed to see wild sheep with horns, 6 palms in length, and described local customs with the dramatic flair of someone more interested in impressing his eventual readers than in providing accurate ethnographic detail. The journey through what is now Western China brought them into the Taklamakan Desert, one of the most forbidding landscapes on Earth. Here, Marco Polo's account becomes both more vivid and more suspect. He describes the terrifying phenomenon of desert mirages, the way that travelers could become separated from their caravans and lost forever in landscapes that seemed to shift like water. He writes about the sounds that the desert makes, mysterious voices that call to travelers in the night, leading them away from the safe path. These descriptions have the ring of truth, but they also echo the stories that were already circulating among Silk Road travelers. The desert was known to be haunted, filled with the spirits of those who had died attempting the crossing. Whether Marco Polo actually experienced these phenomena or simply recorded the stories told around caravan fires is impossible to determine. But this ambiguity points to one of the central challenges in understanding his account. The line between personal experience and received wisdom is often impossible to draw. What we can say with certainty is that the Taklamakan crossing was genuinely dangerous. Caravans that became lost could die of thirst within days. The desert was littered with the bones of pack animals and the abandoned goods of merchants who had been forced to lighten their loads to survive. The cities that ringed the desert Kashmir, Yarkand, Khotan, were oases in the most literal sense, places where water and food could mean the difference between life and death. But Marco Polo's descriptions of these oasis cities reveal another curious gap in his observations. He describes the city's wealth, their bustling markets, their exotic customs, but he says almost nothing about the practical mechanics of long-distance trade. How were prices negotiated between merchants who spoke different languages? How were goods protected from theft during the long journey? How did traders manage the complex logistics of feeding and watering hundreds of pack animals? These omissions suggest that Marco Polo, despite his family's merchant background, was more observer than participant in the actual business of the Silk Road. He traveled with the merchants, benefited from their knowledge and protection, but remained somehow separate from the daily realities of their trade. His account reads like that of a privileged passenger rather than a working trader. The pattern becomes even more pronounced when we consider what Marco Polo doesn't mention at all. Tea, for example, was already a major trade item by the 13th century, yet it appears nowhere in his account. The Great Wall of China, while not yet the continuous structure that tourists visit today, certainly existed in substantial sections, yet Marco Polo never describes it. Paper money was in common use in Kublai Khan's empire, an innovation that would have seemed miraculous to European eyes. Yet Marco Polo's description of it is cursory and confused. Most tellingly, Marco Polo claims to have spent 17 years in Kublai Khan's service, holding important administrative positions throughout the Mongol Empire. Yet Chinese records from the period, which are extensive and detailed, contain no mention of him. It's possible that he served under a Chinese name, or that his role was less significant than he later claimed. But it's also possible that his account significantly exaggerates his importance and access. This brings us to one of the central puzzles of Marco Polo's story. When he finally returned to Venice in 1295, he brought with him stories that seemed almost too fantastic to believe. An empire ruled by a Mongol Khan who controlled territories from Korea to Eastern Europe. Cities with millions of inhabitants, far larger than anything in contemporary Europe. Technological marvels like mechanical clocks, printing presses, and gunpowder weapons. Paper money backed by imperial authority rather than precious metals. The Europe that Marco Polo returned to was still largely rural, still organized around feudal loyalties, still using silver and gold coins for major transactions. The idea of an empire so vast and sophisticated that it made European kingdoms seem like provincial backwaters was almost impossible to process. Many of his contemporaries simply didn't believe him. They called his account Il Milione, the million mocking what they saw as his tendency to exaggerate numbers and inflate the importance of everything he claimed to have seen. But here's what's fascinating about Marco Polo's account when we read it today. The things that seemed most unbelievable to his contemporaries were often the most accurate. Kublai Khan's empire really was vast beyond European comprehension. Chinese cities really did have populations in the millions. Paper money really was in common use. The technological innovations he described really did exist. It was the smaller details, the intimate observations of daily life, where Marco Polo's account is most questionable. His descriptions of local customs often read like the stories that travelers tell to impress listeners, back home exotic enough to seem foreign, but simplified to the point of caricature. Real cultural observation requires a kind of patient attention that seems at odds with the grand scope of Marco Polo's narrative. This tension between the epic and the intimate runs throughout the Silk Road experience. The traders who made these journeys repeatedly, who spent years learning local languages and customs, who built relationships with suppliers and customers across continents. Their stories have largely been lost to history. We have Marco Polo's account precisely because it was so unusual, because a Venetian merchant spending decades in China was remarkable enough to warrant recording. But the everyday heroes of Silk Road trade, the Sogdians, who served as interpreters, the local guides who knew where to find water in the desert, the caravan leaders who could navigate by stars and wind patterns. These people appear in Marco Polo's account only as background figures, unnamed and largely unacknowledged. Perhaps this is inevitable. Adventure stories, almost by definition, focus on the exceptional rather than the routine. Marco Polo's journey was remarkable, precisely because it was so far outside the normal patterns of 13th century European life. But in focusing on the exceptional, we sometimes lose sight of the systems and relationships that made such journeys possible. The Silk Road that Marco Polo traveled was not a wilderness adventure. It was a mature commercial network supported by centuries of accumulated knowledge about routes, weather patterns, political relationships, and cultural customs. The fact that a 17-year-old Venetian could undertake such a journey and survive it speaks not to his exceptional courage, but to the sophisticated infrastructure that Silk Road merchants had created over generations. When Marco Polo finally returned to Venice, he brought with him more than just stories. He carried practical knowledge about navigation, about the properties of different kinds of silk and spices, about political relationships in distant courts. This knowledge would prove valuable to other Venetian merchants, helping to establish trade relationships that would enrich the city for generations. But he also brought something less tangible, a sense of the world's true size and complexity. Europe in the 13th century was still largely isolated, still thinking of itself as the center of civilization. Marco Polo's account, for all its gaps and exaggerations, provided evidence of civilizations that were older, larger, and in many ways more sophisticated than anything in contemporary Europe. This knowledge would gradually reshape European understanding of geography, politics, and possibility. The maps that Christopher Columbus carried when he set out to find a western route to China were based partly on information that Marco Polo had brought back 2 centuries earlier. The Silk Road that Marco Polo traveled would eventually be superseded by maritime routes, but the knowledge he gathered would help to make those later voyages possible. As we follow Marco Polo's journey in our imagination, settling into the rhythm of caravan travel, the long days of walking beside loaded camels, the evening camps where travelers from different cultures shared food and stories, we might ask ourselves what we would have noticed that he missed. Would we have paid more attention to the practical details of trade? Would we have been more curious about the daily lives of ordinary people? Would we have been better observers of the cultural exchanges that happened in market squares and caravan camps? Or would we, like Marco Polo, have been so overwhelmed by the scale and strangeness of the journey that we focused on the most dramatic and exotic elements, missing the quieter stories that unfolded around us every day? The challenge of travel, then as now, is learning to see not just what is different, but what is fundamentally human, the universal needs and desires that connect us across cultures and centuries. Marco Polo's journey ends where our next segment begins in the caravanserai, those oasis trading posts where travelers from across the known world came together to rest, trade, and share the stories that would become the legends of the Silk Road. Verse 3. The caravanserai, oasis of trade, gossip, and shadowy deals picture, if you will, the moment when the sun begins its descent toward the western horizon, and the caravan leader calls for the day's journey to end. The camels, those patient ships of the desert, lower themselves to the ground with soft groans of relief. The dust of the day's travel settles slowly in the still air, and ahead, rising from what seemed like empty landscape, the walls of a caravanserai emerge like a mirage made solid. But a caravanserai is more than just shelter. It is a world unto itself, a temporary city that springs to life each evening and dissolves again with the dawn. Within its walls, the rigid hierarchies of the outside world soften and blur. A Chinese silk merchant might find himself sharing tea with a Byzantine monk. A Persian spice trader might exchange stories with a Sogdian interpreter. For a few hours, the caravanserai becomes a place where the entire Silk Road converges, where information flows as freely as goods, and where the careful negotiations of long-distance trade unfold in languages that few outsiders would ever understand. The caravanserai we enter tonight exists somewhere in the borderlands, between empires, perhaps in the mountains of Afghanistan, or the deserts Central Asia, or the trading cities of Persia. Its exact location matters less than its function. It is one node in a network of hospitality and commerce that made the Silk Road possible. Without these way stations, the great trade routes would have been impossible to navigate. With them, merchants could plan journeys that spanned continents, knowing that food, water, and shelter waited at carefully calculated intervals. The walls of the caravanserai are thick and high, built to withstand both the elements and the occasional bandit attack. The main gate is heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron, wide enough for a loaded camel to pass through comfortably. Above the gate, carved in stone, are symbols that promise protection to all travelers, regardless of their faith, their homeland, or their purpose. These are among the few truly neutral spaces in a world divided by empire and religion. As you pass through the gate, the first thing that strikes you is the sound a polyglot murmur of conversations in languages from across the known world. Chinese mingles with Persian, Arabic with Turkish, Greek with languages that have no names in European tongues. The second thing you notice is the smell, a complex mixture of wood smoke, animal musk, exotic spices, and the particular scent of travel-worn leather and wool. The central courtyard is spacious, large enough to accommodate several caravans at once. Along the walls, covered galleries provide shelter for both people and goods. The camels are led to one side, where fresh straw has been laid and water troughs filled from the caravanserai's well. The merchant's goods are carefully arranged under the galleries, each bale and bundle positioned where it can be easily watched while still being accessible for inspection by potential buyers. But the real business of the caravanserai takes place not in formal markets, but in the informal networks of conversation and connection that emerge each evening. A merchant from Kashgar produces a small leather pouch filled with precious stones, letting potential buyers examine them by the light of oil lamps. A trader from Damascus unwraps a bolt of silk, running his fingers along its surface to demonstrate its quality. A spice dealer from India opens containers of cardamom and cinnamon, letting their fragrances speak for themselves. These are not casual transactions. Each exchange represents months or years of planning, risk, and investment. The merchant who carries silk from China to Persia has already committed enormous resources to goods that might not find buyers. The trader who transports spices from India to Central Asia has gambled that demand in distant markets will justify the dangers of the journey. The caravanserai is where these gambles are won or lost, where reputations are made or destroyed, where information becomes as valuable as any physical commodity. The evening meal is a communal affair, though one governed by subtle hierarchies and protocols. The caravan leaders, those experienced guides who know the routes, the weather patterns, the political situations, occupy positions of honor. The wealthy merchants arrange themselves according to their own complex social calculus. The servants, guards, and interpreters find their own spaces, but even they participate in the general atmosphere of shared information. Food is provided by the caravanserai's staff, but it's often supplemented by contributions from the travelers themselves. A Chinese merchant might share tea that's unknown in these parts. A Persian trader might contribute saffron to the evening's rice. An Arab merchant might produce dates from an oasis hundreds of miles away. The meal becomes a kind of cultural exchange, where flavors and preparation methods mix in combinations that exist nowhere else. But it's the conversations that make these evening gatherings truly remarkable. Information is the currency that everyone trades, regardless of their primary cargo. Who is raiding the passes to the north? Which cities are paying good prices for silk this season? What new taxes are the authorities in Samarkand imposing on foreign merchants? Which routes are safe and which should be avoided? This information network is one of the least documented but most crucial aspects of Silk Road trade. Long before newspapers or official diplomatic channels, merchants and travelers created their own systems for sharing vital intelligence. A rumor heard in one caravanserai might influence trading decisions hundreds of miles away. A warning about bandit activity could cause entire caravans to change their routes. But not all the information shared in caravanserai was purely commercial. These were also places where religious ideas, technological innovations, and cultural practices moved from one civilization to another. A Buddhist monk traveling with a merchant caravan might discuss philosophical concepts with a Persian Zoroastrian priest. A Chinese engineer might explain new techniques for metalworking to local craftsmen. An Arab mathematician might share new methods of calculation with merchants who need to keep complex accounts. The physical layout of the caravanserai encouraged these exchanges. The covered galleries that surrounded the central courtyard created intimate spaces where small groups could gather for extended conversations. The architecture was designed to promote both privacy and openness, private enough for sensitive commercial negotiations, open enough to prevent any single group from dominating the space. As the evening deepens and the oil lamps are lit, the caravanserai takes on an almost magical quality. The harsh realities of desert travel fade into the background, replaced by an atmosphere of possibility and connection. Deals are struck with handshakes and shared cups of tea. Partnerships are formed between merchants who met as strangers at sunset. Plans are made for journeys that won't begin for months or years. But there's also an undercurrent of mystery that runs through these gatherings. Not everyone in the caravanserai is exactly who they claim to be. That quiet merchant in the corner might actually be carrying diplomatic messages between distant courts. The servant who seems to understand several languages might be gathering intelligence for his true masters. The monk who travels with the caravan might be less interested in spreading religious teachings than in mapping the territories he passes through. The Silk Road was never just about commerce. It was also a highway for espionage, diplomacy, and political intrigue. Empires wanted information about their rivals' military capabilities, trade policies, and internal stability. Religious organizations sought to understand the spiritual landscape of distant territories. Even individual merchants had reasons to conceal their true purposes, their financial backing, or their ultimate destinations. The caravanserai provided perfect cover for these activities. In a space where dozens of people from different cultures mingled freely, where conversations happened in multiple languages, where the composition of the group changed every few days, it was almost impossible to monitor everyone's activities. Someone who appeared to be a simple trader might actually be carrying messages between courts, or mapping strategic locations, or gathering information about military movements. This atmosphere of hidden purposes and multiple identities gave the caravanserai a particular kind of tension. Conversations were layered with meanings that only the participants fully understood. Seemingly casual questions about trade routes might actually be intelligence gathering. Gifts of food or small luxury items might be attempts to establish relationships for future use. Yet despite this undercurrent of mystery, the caravanserai remained fundamentally hospitable spaces. The laws of hospitality that governed these places were stronger than political loyalties or commercial competition. A merchant's enemies might share the same meal, sleep under the same roof, and even conduct business with each other, all under the protection of customs that made the caravanserai neutral ground. This neutrality was both practical and essential. If the caravanserai had aligned themselves with particular empires or religious groups, they would have lost their value as meeting places for the diverse communities that used the Silk Road. Instead, they developed their own customs and protocols that transcended the political divisions of the outside world. The management of a caravanserai required considerable diplomatic skill. The caravanserai keeper, usually a local notable with connections to various authorities, had to balance the needs of different groups while maintaining the neutral character of the establishment. This might mean ensuring that merchants from hostile empires were housed in different sections of the complex, or that religious ceremonies of different faiths didn't interfere with each other. But it also meant serving as an informal mediator when disputes arose. Commercial disagreements were inevitable when merchants from different legal traditions tried to conduct business. The caravanserai keeper often found himself arbitrating conflicts that involved not just money, but fundamentally different concepts of contract, obligation, and fairness. These mediation skills were passed down through families, becoming a kind of specialized knowledge that was essential to the functioning of the Silk Road. The most successful caravanserai keepers were those who understood not just the practical needs of travelers, but the cultural sensitivities that could turn minor misunderstandings into major conflicts. As the night deepens and the conversations become more intimate, other kinds of exchanges take place. This is when the more delicate negotiations happen, the deals that involve not just goods, but favors, information, and future obligations. A merchant might arrange not just to buy silk, but to gain access to suppliers that other traders can't reach. A caravan leader might agree to carry messages along with cargo, becoming an unofficial diplomatic courier. These shadow networks of obligation and favor were as important to Silk Road trade as the official commercial relationships. Success often depended not just on having good products, but on having reliable partners in distant cities. The caravanserai was where these partnerships were formed, tested, and renewed. The sleeping arrangements in the caravanserai reflected its democratic character. While there were private rooms for the wealthiest merchants, most travelers slept in the communal areas, their blankets spread on carpets or raised platforms. The proximity forced a kind of intimacy that would have been impossible in more formal settings. Merchants who might never meet in their home cities found themselves sleeping side by side, sharing the vulnerability of travelers far from home. This enforced intimacy created its own opportunities for connection and understanding. Prejudices that seemed natural in distant homelands could dissolve when faced with the reality of shared hardship and mutual dependence. A Chinese merchant might discover that his Persian counterpart faced the same challenges of currency exchange and language barriers. A Christian trader might find that his Muslim colleague shared similar concerns about family and faith. But the caravanserai was also a place where differences became more pronounced. The evening prayers of different faiths created a complex soundscape of devotion. Dietary restrictions meant that meals became exercises in accommodation and compromise. Business practices that seemed natural in one culture could appear strange or even offensive in another. These cultural encounters were handled with a delicacy that spoke to the sophistication of Silk Road communities. Most participants understood that their own prosperity depended on maintaining relationships with people from vastly different backgrounds. This created a kind of practical tolerance that was more flexible than the official policies of any empire. As the fire in the central courtyard burns lower and the conversations become more subdued, the caravanserai begins its transformation from active marketplace to resting place. Guards are posted not just by the caravanserai management, but by the merchant groups themselves. The most valuable goods are secured under lock and key. Plans are finalized for the next day's journey. But even as the commercial activity winds down, other forms of exchange continue. This is when the storytellers emerge, professional entertainers who travel the routes, collecting tales from each culture they encounter and weaving them into new narratives that reflect the cosmopolitan character of Silk Road society. These stories are more than entertainment, they are vehicles for cultural transmission. A story that begins in Chinese folklore might pick up Persian elements, Indian philosophical concepts, and Arabic literary techniques as it travels westward. By the time it reaches its final audience, it has become something entirely new, a hybrid creation that reflects the complex cultural exchanges of the Silk Road itself. The storytellers are among the most observant chroniclers of Silk Road life, though their accounts are embedded in fiction rather than formal history. Through their tale eyes, we can glimpse the daily realities that official documents ignore, the relationships between merchants and their servants, the role of women in long-distance trade, the impact of constant travel on family structures and social obligations. As you settle into your blankets in the caravanserai, listening to the soft murmur of conversations in languages you don't understand, you might reflect on the remarkable achievement that this simple building represents. Here, in the middle of what maps might label as empty wilderness, human ingenuity has created a space where the world's diversity can coexist, where strangers can become partners, where the vast distances of the Silk Road shrink to the intimate scale of shared meals and common concerns. Tomorrow, the caravans will disperse again, each heading toward its own destination. The temporary community that formed within these walls will dissolve, its members scattered across the trade routes of Asia. But the connections made here, the business relationships, the friendships, the shared knowledge will continue to shape the flow of goods and ideas across continents. The caravanserai sleeps, but the dreams within its walls span the known world, carrying with them the hopes and plans of those who have chosen to make their livings from the patient work of connecting distant places, distant peoples, and distant times. Verse 4. The Persian herbalist, navigating between cultures, recording remedies and myths from the communal world of the caravanserai. We turn now to a more solitary figure, someone who moves through the same landscapes, but sees them through entirely different eyes. Rashid al-Mulk is not his real name, but rather the name he has chosen for himself, meaning guide of the kingdom, though the kingdom he serves is not any earthly empire, but the realm of healing knowledge that recognizes no borders. He travels the Silk Road not as a merchant seeking profit, but as a scholar seeking wisdom. His pack animals carry not silk or spices, but carefully wrapped manuscripts, delicate glass vials, and dried plants collected from gardens and mountainsides across the known world. Where merchants see opportunity, he sees patterns of illness and healing that connect all human communities. Where others collect gold, he collects remedies that might save lives in distant places. Rashid's journey begins not with commercial ambition, but with a question that has haunted healers since ancient times. Why do the same diseases affect people differently in different places? Why does a remedy that works perfectly in the markets of Isfahan fail completely in the mountains of Afghanistan? What do the healing traditions of distant cultures know that his own Persian teachers have never discovered? These questions have led him to spend the better part of 20 years traveling the routes that merchants use for trade, but using them for an entirely different purpose. He has learned to read landscapes not for their commercial potential, but for their medicinal properties. That valley where caravans rest might also be home to a plant that treats fever. That mountain pass that merchants curse for its difficulty might yield roots that ease the pain of childbirth. The morning finds Rashid in his small traveling study, a felt tent that he sets up each evening, whatever the weather. Unlike the merchants who sleep in caravanserai when possible, he often prefers the solitude of open country, where he can observe the plants and animals that most travelers ignore. His tent is modest but carefully organized, with specific places for his writing materials, his collection of samples, and the small brass scales he uses to measure precise quantities of medicines. By the light of a carefully tended oil lamp, he opens one of his most precious possessions, a leather-bound journal where he records not just remedies and recipes, but observations about the relationship between place, people, and healing. The pages are filled with diagrams of plants, careful notes about preparation methods, and detailed accounts of conversations with healers from cultures that have never been described in any Persian text. Today's entry begins with a sketch of a plant he encountered yesterday, a small, unremarkable herb that grows in the rocky soil near mountain streams. The local shepherds call it breath of stone, and they brew its leaves into a tea that treats the chest ailments that plague people who live at high altitudes. But Rashid has noticed that the same plant, when prepared differently, might help with the stomach problems that often affect travelers who eat unfamiliar foods. This kind of cross-cultural pattern recognition is Rashid's particular genius. Where most people see individual remedies tied to specific places, he sees universal principles that manifest differently in different environments. The Chinese practice of using willow bark for pain relief connects to the Persian use of meadowsweet for the same purpose. The Indian system of balancing hot and cold foods to maintain health echoes the Greek theory of bodily humors, though the specific applications are entirely different. But documenting these connections requires more than botanical knowledge. It demands cultural sensitivity of the highest order. Each healing tradition is embedded in religious beliefs, social customs, and worldviews that can't be easily separated from the practical aspects of treatment. A remedy that works in one cultural context might fail in another, not because of any difference in the medicine itself, but because healing always involves the relationship between healer and patient, between individual and community. Rashid has learned to approach each culture's healing traditions with the respect of a student, rather than the assumptions of an expert. In a Chinese monastery, he spent months learning not just which herbs the monks used, but how their Buddhist understanding of suffering and compassion shaped their approach to healing. In an Indian port city, he studied with physicians who saw illness as a disruption in the cosmic balance, requiring treatments that addressed spiritual as well as physical symptoms. These extended apprenticeships have taught him that healing knowledge is never just technical. It's always embedded in stories, myths, and beliefs that give meaning to the experience of illness and recovery. A Persian physician might understand the same plant completely differently than a Chinese herbalist, not because their observations are wrong, but because they're asking different questions and seeking different kinds of understanding. This morning, as he prepares for another day of travel, Rashid reflects on a conversation he had 3 days ago with an elderly woman in a small trading town. She was known locally as a healer of women's ailments, and she possessed knowledge about childbirth and fertility that wasn't written down anywhere, but passed from mother to daughter through generations of careful observation. The woman was initially suspicious of Rashid's questions. Foreign men rarely showed interest in women's medicine, and when they did, it was often to dismiss it as superstition. But something in his manner, perhaps the careful way he listened, or the respectful way he took notes, convinced her to share some of her knowledge. She told him about a plant that grew only in certain mountain valleys, at specific altitudes, and only during particular seasons. When prepared correctly, it could ease the pain of childbirth without making the mother drowsy or confused. But the preparation required not just technical knowledge, but understanding of timing, of lunar cycles, of the specific prayers and rituals that made the medicine effective. As Rashid recorded her instructions, he realized that he was documenting not just a medical recipe, but an entire system of knowledge that connected botanical observation with astronomical calculation, practical experience with spiritual belief. The remedy worked not despite these seemingly non-medical elements, but because of them. They were all part of a coherent approach to healing that Western medicine was only beginning to understand. This encounter illustrates one of the central challenges of Rashid's work. He's not just collecting remedies that can be transferred from one culture to another. He's trying to understand how different societies think about health, illness, and the relationship between human beings and the natural world. Each culture's healing traditions reflect deeper assumptions about what it means to be human, what causes suffering, and what kinds of intervention are appropriate or effective. The Chinese physicians he studied would see illness as a disruption in the flow of vital energy through the body. Their treatments focus on restoring balance and harmony, using techniques like acupuncture and herbal formulas that work over time to strengthen the body's natural healing processes. The Indian doctors he's learned from understand illness in terms of cosmic principles, hot and cold, wet and dry, the influence of planetary movements on human health. Greek and Roman medical traditions, which heavily influence Persian practice, emphasize the importance of understanding the body as a kind of mechanical system, where specific symptoms indicate specific problems that can be addressed with specific remedies. Each approach has its strengths and limitations, and Rashid has learned that the most effective healing often comes from combining insights from multiple traditions. But this synthesis requires more than just technical knowledge. It demands a kind of cultural translation that's as complex as any linguistic interpretation. When a Chinese physician talks about qi and a Persian doctor discusses vital heat, are they describing the same phenomenon in different terms? Or are they talking about fundamentally different concepts? How do you test whether a remedy that works within one cultural context will be effective when applied in another? These questions have led Rashid to develop his own methods for evaluating healing practices. He looks for remedies that work consistently across different cultural contexts. Herbs that seem to have similar effects, whether they're used by Chinese monks or Arab traders or Persian physicians. He pays particular attention to treatments that address conditions common to all travelers. Digestive problems from unfamiliar foods, respiratory issues from dust and dry air, infections that can turn serious without proper care. His traveling medicine chest contains remedies that represent this cross-cultural synthesis. There's a preparation for stomach ailments that combines a Chinese understanding of digestive balance with Persian knowledge of specific herbs and Indian techniques for preparation. There's a treatment for wounds that draws on Greek ideas about cleaning and dressing injuries, Arab knowledge of antiseptic plants, and Central Asian practices for preventing infection. But Rashid's work goes beyond practical medicine. He's also documenting the stories, myths, and legends that surround healing practices in different cultures. These narratives, he's discovered, often contain valuable information about how medicines work, what conditions they're most effective for, and what side effects or dangers to watch for. The mythological associations of different plants often reflect careful observation of their properties. A plant that's associated with moon goddesses might be most effective when harvested at night or during certain lunar phases. An herb that appears in stories about journeys to the underworld might be particularly useful for treating serious illnesses that bring patients close to death. This afternoon, as his small caravan winds through a valley where 3 different trade routes converge, Rashid observes the layered landscape of cultural exchange that defines the Silk Road. In the fields beside the road, he can see plants that originated in China growing alongside species native to Persia, tended by farmers whose ancestors came from Central Asia. The very agriculture reflects the mixing of traditions that characterizes these borderlands. In the village, where they stop for the night, he seeks out the local healer, a man whose grandfather was Chinese, whose father was Persian, and who learned his craft from an Arab physician who settled in the valley 50 years ago. This healer's practice combines elements from all these traditions, creating treatments that are perfectly adapted to the specific conditions of this particular place, but that draw knowledge from across the known world. The conversation that follows, conducted in a mixture of Persian and Arabic, with occasional Chinese phrases, illustrates the complexity of medical knowledge transmission along the Silk Road. The healer describes a treatment for altitude sickness that combines Chinese acupuncture points with Persian herbal formulas and Arab theories about the movement of bodily fluids. It's a remedy that couldn't have been developed in any single cultural tradition, but that emerges from the unique conditions of cross-cultural contact. As Rashid carefully records these hybrid healing practices, he reflects on the parallels between his work and that of the merchants who travel the same routes. Just as traders identify goods that will be valued in distant markets, he's learning to recognize medical knowledge that might prove useful in different cultural contexts. Just as successful commerce requires understanding local customs and preferences, effective healing requires sensitivity to the beliefs and expectations of different communities. But there's an important difference between trading goods and sharing knowledge. A bolt of silk remains essentially the same, whether it's sold in Chang'an or Constantinople. Medical knowledge, by contrast, must be adapted to local conditions, local beliefs, and local needs. A remedy that works perfectly in the dry climate of Central Asia might need to be modified for the humid conditions of Indian coastal cities. This process of adaptation is where Rashid's work becomes most creative and most challenging. He's not just copying remedies from one culture to another. He's developing new syntheses that preserve the essential wisdom of different traditions, while making them accessible to healers who work in different contexts. His evening ritual reflects this synthetic approach. As he prepares his simple meal, he uses culinary principles he's learned from different cultures' Indian spices that aid digestion, Chinese techniques for balancing flavors, Persian methods for preparing foods that nourish rather than merely satisfy. Even his daily bread represents a kind of cultural synthesis, made from grain varieties that originated in different regions, but that have been adapted to local growing conditions. After eating, he spends time updating his notes, but also copying passages from the medical texts he carries with him. These books, written in Arabic, Persian, Greek, and Chinese, represent centuries of accumulated healing wisdom. But Rashid's goal is not just to preserve this knowledge. It's to create new texts that make the wisdom of different traditions accessible to healers who might never have the opportunity to travel as widely as he has. The manuscripts he's working on represent a new kind of medical literature texts that acknowledge cultural differences while identifying universal principles, that respect traditional knowledge while remaining open to innovation, that serve practical needs while maintaining connection to the spiritual and philosophical foundations of healing. As night deepens and the sounds of the village fade into the gentle chorus of insects and night birds, Rashid contemplates the invisible networks of knowledge that connect healers across vast distances. A remedy he learned in a Chinese monastery might eventually help a Persian mother through a difficult childbirth. An Indian technique for preparing medicines might be adapted by Arab physicians to treat desert illnesses. A Central Asian understanding of the relationship between diet and health might influence Greek theories about disease prevention. These connections happen slowly, often taking generations to fully develop, but they represent one of the most important and least recognized aspects of Silk Road exchange, the movement of healing knowledge that has improved human health and reduced suffering across cultures and centuries. The stars above are the same ones that guide the merchant caravans, but for Rashid they represent something different, a vast network of correspondence between the celestial patterns that influence human health and the terrestrial plants and minerals that can restore balance when illness disrupts the natural order. His work is part of an ancient tradition that sees healing as a way of harmonizing human beings with the larger patterns of the cosmos. Tomorrow will bring new encounters, new plants to examine, new healers to learn from, new stories to record. The journey continues, but not toward any particular destination. Rashid's true goal is not to reach a specific place, but to deepen his understanding of the connections that link all healing traditions, all human communities, all the diverse ways that people have learned to care for one another across the centuries and across the vast distances of the Silk Road. In his final notes of the evening, he writes not about specific remedies or particular techniques, but about the larger pattern he's beginning to perceive, a pattern that suggests that all healing knowledge, despite its cultural variations, reflects a fundamental human commitment to reducing suffering and preserving life. This commitment, he believes, is what truly connects the scattered communities of the Silk Road, what makes it possible for strangers to trust each other with their most precious secrets, what transforms the mere exchange of goods into something approaching wisdom. Conclusion. As our journey through these interconnected stories draws to a close, we find ourselves back where we began contemplating the dust that connects distant places and distant times. But now that dust carries with it the dreams of Li Mei, the silk weaver whose patient work connected her small workshop to markets she would never see. It holds the footsteps of Marco Polo, whose young eyes witnessed wonders that his older self would spend a lifetime trying to accurately describe. It bears the conversations of countless travelers who found temporary community within the walls of caravanserai scattered across the known world. And it preserves the careful observations of healers like Rashid, who understood that knowledge, like silk, becomes more valuable when it travels. The Silk Road we've explored tonight is not the grand highway of popular imagination, but something more intimate and more human, a network of relationships built on trust, curiosity, and the simple recognition that what we need might be found in the most unexpected places, offered by the most unlikely people. These routes still exist, though the goods they carry and the methods of transport have changed beyond recognition. The same human needs that drove ancient trade, the desire for beauty, for healing, for connection with distant others, continue to shape our world. The same challenges that faced Silk Road travelers, how to bridge cultural differences, how to build trust across vast distances, how to balance profit with responsibility, remain as relevant today as they were 1,000 years ago. Perhaps most importantly, the same sense of wonder that drew merchants and monks, healers and adventurers to undertake journeys that would last for years remains alive in anyone who has ever been curious about the world beyond their immediate experience. The Silk Road was, ultimately, a monument to human curiosity, to the belief that somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, lay something worth the risk of seeking. Rest now, and let your dreams carry you along those ancient paths, where the stories of individual lives weave together into the larger tapestry of human connection that spans continents and centuries, connecting us all in ways we're only beginning to understand.